Is Homi Karas. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and we are going to be discussing how to grow out of debt. We've got a very full panel this morning. I think it's a topic, I think, of extraordinary interest around the world. Certainly, there's been a lot of interest in this webinar. So I look forward to a terrific discussion. So quickly on House rules, we will be recording this session. What we're going to do is we're going to have very brief presentations from a number of panelists. Then we're going to take questions in two different sessions. I would request you to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring them, and we'll then be able to take them. So without further ado, let me start. Our host this morning is Dr. Ibrahim El-Badawi. He is the Executive Director of the Economic Research Forum. Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Homi. And good afternoon and good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining us today as we address the very important and timely topic in the webinar on growing out of debt, perspectives from developing countries around the world. Countries' public debt difficulties are partly due to the series of adverse shocks hitting the global economy from COVID-19 to the Ukraine war and the consequent inflationary episodes and decline or even reversal of external finance, a return of sudden stops of sorts. Often, these have exacerbated pre-existing domestic structural weaknesses. The impact go well beyond fiscal sustainability and the need for fiscal consolidation, affecting patterns of economic growth, social inclusion, and well-being. The challenge is stark. Inflation inaction would lead to financial crisis, but austerity alone could only stabilize debt in the very short term. Failing to develop a convincing response raises the threat of a vicious cycle of economic, social, and political declines, including a retreat into populism and destructive social polarization. Against this backdrop, IDRC launched regional programs to support evidence-based research, addressing debt sustainability challenges and possible pathways for economic recovery in MENA. The project was led by ARF and Finance for Development Lab, FDL, with intellectual leadership of Ishaq Dewan as principal investigator. Focusing on the oil-importing middle-income countries of the region, Egypt, Lebanon, Tunisia, Morocco, Sudan, and Jordan, the program's objective is to clarify the macroeconomic risks related to external and internal balances and the sustainability of public and external debt, and to propose an overall strategy to tackle these risks, trying to find a balance between austerity and innovative growth measures. In the same context, similar work has been initiated and supported by IDRC in other developing regions. This webinar, organized by ARF and FDL, RedSur, and IDRC, will present findings from this recent research in low-income countries, highlight tensions and trade-offs generated by the debt difficulties across the countries studied, and explore policy recommendations from Southern perspective. Panelists will be addressing the financial, economic, social, and developmental effects of ongoing debt difficulties and their possible implications and priorities for domestic policy. From across the developing world, 6 case studies from the Middle East and North Africa region, I already mentioned, 3 Latin American and Caribbean countries, Bolivia, Honduras, and Paraguay, and 3 from Sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Uganda will be shared. We hope today's event will serve as a platform for sharing the findings of the collective research efforts from different regions and to foster a cross-fertilization and mutual learning across regions of the world. I would like to express our appreciation to the IDRC for their significant contribution to this work and for their continuous support to development research. Finally, I thank all the presenters who have joined us today, and I look forward to engaging and stimulating presentations and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, and it's really useful to get an understanding and the views of so many developing countries in this seminar. We'll hear from a few panelists, but there's a wealth of papers. I think you mentioned a dozen papers, case studies that are behind all of this research. And I think that will be invaluable material. So our next speaker is Cecilia Alemani. She is the UN Women Ad Interim Regional Director for the Americas and the Caribbean, with 2 previous decades of academic affiliation with the South American Network on Applied Economics, RedSur. Cecilia.
Thank you, Homi, and of course to all the organizers for this brief possibility to input the amazing routes of researchers we are going to all hear in a few minutes. And of course, as Ibrahim raised, I want to very welcome all the effort across the globe that we are going to see. Of course, it's a global South perspective, but in very close interaction of the role of IDRC, also promoting innovative research on that. In the case of RedSur, that of course I know very closely, and we will hear from Ramiro Albreu, Mike Ruche, Alemayu Geda, and Paul Lacuma in the following rounds in terms of the different studies that Ibrahim raised. The focus was really to promote a pandemic recovery and having evidence on the growing debt crisis from the global South. And I want to put, of course, the lens on the gender dimension of this very briefly, not only because of my role on UN Women, but this has been a concern that in early days of this research, several years ago, we start to discuss also with Arjan Dehan in IDRC and the team across this research. And of course, is not the link is not evident for everyone, and of course the different ways and evidence-based efforts to make it clear varies across countries. We have a corpus of agreement around the world that we are facing or growing or seeing grow in a debt crisis. We also have a common understanding across the world that we have protracted multiple crises, included COVID, that of course give different signs today than 2 or 3 years ago, but also the food crisis. However, and the climate change one. These are kind of common mantras when we discuss multiple crises in all the world with any relation with the income. So these global protracted crises are not necessarily related with the income, but of course they reflect in different manners depending on the country's structural conditions and possibilities to face them or have different instruments to face them. On another hand, we have other authors like Fraser or Nancy Fraser that are calling for a new analysis on the democracy crisis, the care crisis, and the climate change crisis. All of them perceived as results of the current economic system and model. And I would like to put all these analyses together because the relation may be not obvious for everyone, but we will see in research efforts that the analysis of the burden of debt management on potential inabilities to finance climate change transition is also valid for the difficulties to really fund or have more sustainable solutions for the social transition. So this vision of interlinked transitions, it's really a lesson learned from the past. And of course, we can always learn from Latin America on how to manage or not manage debt and the impact that this has on the structural inequalities, and we will hear from of that, I'm sure, from Ramiro Abreu in a few minutes. But there is a common understanding that even if we have very specific policies or programs challenging gender equality or women's poverty or the different structural inequalities that women face, and of course in some regions like Latin America, this is increased when we talk about indigenous women, rural women, Afro-descendants or migrants, and this can be also relevant for other developing countries across the world. Any of these specific small investments, I would say, because in terms of gender budgeting is really small investments, would never revert structural inequalities impact of macroeconomic policies or debt restructuring that may reduce employment possibility, training or capacity development possibilities, livelihoods, or even public goods or social services spending. So this exacerbation of the burdens that macroeconomic policies, including fiscal, but also any debt conditionality may have on women's in poverty situation, it's really much broader than the common understanding when we discuss these issues. So in many of the scenarios that RedSur has been developing, and we will speak around the day, of course, there is in-depth analysis on the relation between the debt burden, the fiscal space, climate change, and care. Why? And my last point is on care, Hormi, and we will follow. I follow to you to follow the flow. It's that the care, what used to be called the care economy, that is more and more understood beyond the value chain that care can be in terms of a productive sector. In the case of Latin America, it has been really identified, and not only, of course, but there is growing evidence that small investments on GDP in national care systems really have a multiplier effect, not only in terms of labor creation, of course, in the sector itself, also in terms of leveraging SMEs, small companies and cooperatives that are part of this care value chain, but also, of course, creating new capacities, new space. We talk about time poverty, that is a dimension of poverty that women are increasingly facing. And of course, COVID-19 put this in evidence for everyone. This is not only true in developing countries, but merely true because the difficulties to really have not only income, the household income, but also because among those in poverty, there is a very high percentage of women-led households that really face all these structural inequalities. And in some countries, when you look, I'm just going to put the example of Argentina. If you look those households that are in the poorest quintile, women tend to spend 8 hours a day in care work at home, non-remunerated care work. And of course, these undermine any capacity, not only to combine these with decent work, but also the possibility of have some kind of training or capacity development to have better conditions in the future. In addition, of course, it is a sector like many of our countries where informality is higher than in anyone. So I hope that our discussion today will help us to understand of course, the spending, but also the income restrictions that are affecting all the societies, and of course, and face it without any.
Okay. We're losing you in and out, Cecilia, for a second.
I'm done.
Thank you so much. I think that you've very powerfully and clearly made the point that very often a debt crisis is it's a symptom of ills elsewhere in the economy, and so to come to look at the solutions to a debt crisis, we shouldn't narrowly focus just on the set of debt issues. We should focus on what those root causes of those ills are. And I think that's why this seminar is entitled Growing Out of Debt, because it's precisely the absence of taking advantage of those growth opportunities that is leading sometimes to the debt problems. So thank you. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to move and quickly hear from Martin Kessler from the Finance for Development Lab about what actually went on in Paris, Martin, where there was considerable talk and expectations for something new to emerge. But certainly the newspaper headlines on what happened on the debt front were, shall I say, less than flattering.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, indeed. Thanks a lot, Romy, and thanks a lot to Dr. Yohaim and IDRC for organizing this seminar. Yes, indeed. So I mean, the summit of Paris was not designed as a summit on debt. And so in a way, we shouldn't have expected too much on this topic. First, it was more about linking development issues and environment, and in a way, at least on the principle that the country that was there agreed to, and there's a list of countries that formally endorsed the summary of the summit. It was more about linking the fight against climate change and its consequences and other development priorities, some of which Cecilia alluded to, poverty, inequality, gender, etc. And I think one of the points that the summit wanted to make in general was to say that there's no inherent contradiction between the two. So that would be the first point. So in a way, that obviously limits what we can do both on climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and on development, but it was not central to the narrative. The second thing was that, in a way, it was a space for discussion, and I think what it really succeeded to, beyond concrete outcomes, in a way, they matter, but the narrative also matters. And I think one success was to have a real dialogue between countries in the south and countries in the north that were present, and they were a bit less present than countries of the south. It was actually impressive participation, both from large emerging countries like China, the premier level, and Brazil with its president, and also Barbados, obviously, which was co-organizer of the meeting, and African and the African region, a bit less so in advanced economies, which was a disappointment. But I think that meeting was a bit different from what we used to, where it was heads of state, where we're used to discussions around finance ministers at the spring and annual meetings of the IMF, the World Bank. It was really a political discussion at heads of state level, and that mattered for the narrative. And one of the other elements was really the idea of more integrating those voices. And how did that impact discussions on that? So I think there was an important there's a few proposals in the outcomes that are not concrete outcomes, but that are proposals that will be inscribed in the roadmap of the future meetings. So one is revising the debt sustainability analysis, and that will be an important point for this discussion today. How to make them more attuned to the risks and the vulnerabilities of climate change. And other priorities. That will be one. Another one is to better understand the linkages between nature, climate, and debt, and that's kind of semi-formally endorsed in the summary of the discussions of a group that we don't know exactly what it will do, but it's a group endorsed by Colombia, Kenya, and France to work on the discussion, inscribe them in the formal discussions of the G20. And there again, I think research on case studies from developing countries will be very important to integrate into those questions, into the policy-making dialogue. So in a way, there's an opportunity here for researchers to really have an impact on those discussions at the highest level. The third one was, I think, a true success, which was not directly linked to Paris, to the summit, but I think really accelerated and a little bit unlocked because of the Paris summit, which was the restructuring of the Zambian debt, which had been stuck for the last 3 years, and finally reached an agreement. Again, I think the agreement was reached. We don't know exactly the details, but I think it was an important agreement, only to show that the common framework could work on a large restructuring. There was Chad before, but it was the first time that the large restructuring of official bilateral creditor, and that we seem to have a memorandum of understanding that will, and a debt treatment that will be published in the next 2 weeks. And so that I think is a byproduct of the summit. It also shows that the common framework can work, at least in one case, in 3 years. What next case will be, in particular Ghana, will be looked at closely. But I think it's important to see that where can this progress come from. There's another kind of parallel process with the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which was instituted by the IMF, the World Bank, and the G20 presidency of India to reform the common framework. And here again, I think civil society should and will, and that includes your think tanks and researchers, should and will influence this process. And it's that there will be opportunity to do that, at least from what we hear. I think, allow me to just close on this. So we know that the next debt restructuring deals will be difficult, that the problems are more, some are really about liquidity, and for now the existing global financial safety nets are not enough to fix those, and that can be very costly. And again, I think the range and the diversity of case studies will show where the multilateral tools work, where they're absent, which ones we need to create. And so I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to discussion of the case studies.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, I think that indeed the Zambia case was a, thank goodness we actually have brought it to a close after such a long time. But it is a good indication that the common framework can be effective in certain circumstances, although, of course, it took far too long to be considered an effective, an efficient resolution. So what we're going to do now is move to some presentations of case studies. And what we're going to do is to ask each of our panelists to basically reflect on two different sets of questions. In the first round, we will talk more about the nature and severity of debt challenges. Do we believe that these are really liquidity issues? Are they solvency issues? How do we think about the different components of debt? Domestic debt, external debt, debt with collateral involved in it. I think we will talk about the implications of different debt strategies in terms of what that means to fiscal space. And then, of course, importantly, about the kinds of choices that countries face in terms of austerity versus growth, the short-term programs like the very short-term standby arrangement for Pakistan that's just been put in place against long-term immediate resolution of the crisis over the long run. So I think that this first round is going to be a little bit diagnostic, and then we'll come to a round two, which will focus much more on changes in global rules and the reform of the IFIs, etc., the kinds of things that we might need to promote a more efficient restructuring exercise. So to get us started on this first round of questions, really reflecting what is happening in individual developing countries, we're going to start with Ramiro Albrillo. Ramiro is a principal researcher in the South American Network of Applied Economics, RedSur, also a professor at the University of Buenos Aires in the areas of economics and finance. Ramiro, you have 5 minutes starting now. Ramiro, you're on mute.
Okay, now, thanks for the invitation. Thanks, IDRC, Ibrahim, and everyone. I think that we can learn a lot on having these cross-regional discussions. Now, regarding Latin America, I think that it is important to understand that, in a way, the outlook is kind of not that pessimistic as in many other specific regions or countries outside Latin America. Of course, I'm coming from Argentina, so it's not the case of my country. I'm talking about the region as a whole. So I'm going to bring an outlook that can show some risks, but also some room for thinking about alternative paths. Not only just conditionalities and IMF supported programs and so on. So first, again, I mean, in a way, we have been learning through decades about becoming more resilient, I mean, in Latin America. I mean, we learned the hard way, by getting into new crises, of course. But if you look at, for example, here you have the share of public debt denominated in local currency, you can see a huge movement away from dollarization of public debt, for example. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, we have a lot of, in the public bond market, we have a lot of debt in local currency in fixed rates. And that's something kind of new for us. So again, I mean, and it's the same if you look at the maturity of public bonds and the external legislation, and it's the same under domestic legislation as well. I mean, you will see a lot of improvement in debt management. Of course, this improvement has to do with an improvement in, we can say, macroeconomic policy at large, in a way, thinking about low inflation settings, about independent central banks, about, trying to get fiscal surpluses, at least structural balances, and also trying to, improve the analysis on debt management risks and so on. So if you check, I don't know, Chile, Colombia, Uruguay, even Peru, you will see this, this learning through crisis, process. Of course, this is not the case of Argentina, but as a region, I can say that in a way we are now better prepared, for shocks than in the past. So I think that this is important to highlight. Of course, that the outlook is uncertain because we don't know about how persistent the current situation will be, particularly for the larger economies in the region, for Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil. Of course, if you look at GDP growth, there you see Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. You will see this decade will be a decade of low growth. Check the LAC figures. But also, if you look at Argentina, I think that even these figures are too optimistic from my perspective, but also Brazil and Mexico. So in a way, the big economies are going to a structural transformation. That, of course, also with a lot of shocks as well, like pandemics. I mean, but I think that it's like a long-term trend of some secular stagnation, in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. And I think that will impact the rest of the region. So in a way, in the near or medium-term future, we will see like low growth. Maybe it's not the case in the Caribbean, in some Central American countries, but for sure in the biggest countries in the region. Of course, also you will see low growth and also higher interest rates. So for the dynamics in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, you will see this worsening, some pressure on higher debts, not because of fiscal accounts, but because of, the interest rate growth differential. So this will be an issue in the next 5 to 10 years, particularly in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and I think that maybe Chile, not now, but maybe in the near future as well. So again, I mean, I think that we are more resilient, but also I think that the context is changing, you know, and if these external conditions will persist, and also if growth patterns will persist to be like stagnant, remain stagnant, I think that this can change, mainly for biggest economies, but then maybe for the other economies of the region as well. And of course, I mean, I'm talking of Latin America, but we have is a lot of different experiences. Again, we have this average improvement through crisis, through decades. Then we have some specific situation in, we can say, long-term growth for the biggest economies. And then we have
a couple of minutes, Ramiro.
Yes, I'm just finishing here. We have, you know, a very heterogeneous picture. If you look at country by country analysis, you can see there at the right, high public external debt, maybe mainly with multilaterals for the Caribbean and Central America. You have Brazil, that is mainly just domestic debt. Well, a lot of different stories, the same about maturity and so on. But let me just finish with that. If I have to bet about Latin American debt, of course I can be totally wrong, because if the future is Latin America is debt. But I think that this scenario of just, you know, we will live with high debt in the future. It's not that we will have debt crisis, you know, as you know, as in the 80s or something like that, or in the late 90s. I believe more about, you know, trying to manage high debt, increasing demands for fiscal consolidation, you know, along the path, but no more than that.
Thank you so very much. It's good to start with a relatively optimistic viewpoint that yes, debt will be high, but it might be manageable in many countries. So next we have Ishak Diwan. He's the Director of Research for the Finance for Development Lab, which is a new institute located at the Paris School of Economics, where he also teaches economics. And of course, FDL is one of the research leads for this project. Ishak, floor is yours.
Thank you, Homi. You know, I'm not going to show my slides because I think it's impossible to compete with Ramiro's colors. They were too beautiful. And to save on time, I will just only speak. When we talk about the Middle East, I think we're increasingly talking of actually a debt crisis, you know, leading to something unsustainable that would require difficult choices. We're really talking about the oil importing countries and middle income countries, in particular, Lebanon has already defaulted, is in a deep crisis. Egypt and Tunisia will have lost access to the Eurobond market already and have difficulties and will have increased difficulties refinancing coming maturities in the bond market. In particular, we're also talking about Jordan and Morocco that still have access to the market, but have pretty high levels of debt. And we could be talking about Sudan, which is now a country in deep political and security crisis as well, but also with an open debt crisis for several decades now. Basically, in all these countries, the public debt to GDP is between 80% and 100%. So it's pretty much elevated by, you know, standard IMF level. These are countries in debt distress. And indeed, the market, you know, is already signaling that some of them are in market distress. Now, several specificities. All these countries except Lebanon got debt reduction in the 90s. And so these are more recent, you know, outgrowth of debt. Most of the debt has grown post 2011, after the Arab Spring, actually, really for two reasons. One is that governments had run larger deficits to stabilize the social situation, and two, growth was lower. So it's the debt dynamic, it's combination of both of these things. Many countries have tried to stabilize by having primary surpluses. Recently, Egypt is an example. Tunisia is not an example. Lebanon is an example. But then the dynamics were bad, and the interest rates were higher than the growth rates of the economy, and they haven't been able to stabilize these debts. And I would think that, I mean, in our recent report with the ERF, the main conclusion is that we have a growth problem. In reality, it's been very difficult to get the growth going, and governments have taken advantage of the easy credit of the 90s of the 2000s, excuse me, to borrow in order to delay reforms, and that ultimately, and I will speak about that more in the second round, this is a time to seriously consider growth as an opportunity. A key specificity of these debts compared to the debts of the 80s is that they are mostly internal. That's very much like Latin America. At least half, and in some countries more than half, is internal, and actually it really colors the way in which these debt crises are being approached. So when we ask, is this a liquidity or a solvency question, in a way it's more difficult than before to tell, because external debt is 20-30% of GDP. I mean, a priori it's not a big deal. Domestic debt can be controlled through inflation, through various ways, but then many of these countries are or will be losing access to external liquidity. So the immediate problem is actually the inavailability of foreign exchange, the difficulty of having to refinance the debt. And if you don't refinance the debt, then the shock is that you have to basically devalue in order to balance your external account, or squeeze imports so that whatever foreign exchange you have, more of it is used to repay actually obligations when they mature, so that you don't run out of reserves, and some austerity in order to make space for paying more external debts. Now, the devaluation at the same time reduces domestic debts, and the big example there is the adjustment program of Egypt in 2016, a first IMF adjustment program, where actually there was a major devaluation, like 50%, which really reduced domestic debt for a while, but didn't manage to generate a supply response and to increase growth. Gave Egypt access to more borrowing. $100 billion later of external borrowing, we're back to the same problem. So the tendency with this kind of debt problem, where most of it is internal, but you need external liquidity, the tendency is to have austerity and devaluation. The danger is that you really increase inflation, therefore poverty, you're pushed to cut subsidies. So we have social instability, big risk. Second problem is that Egypt is encountering now, Lebanon encountered, is the difficulty of stabilizing the situation. Because you devalue, generate inflation, it does reduce domestic debt, but then on the flow side, you need high interest rates, which keeps generating bad expectation, more devaluation. So it's very hard to actually adjust the situation, stabilize the situation. Egypt is in the middle.
One minute, please.
Yeah, Egypt is in the middle of trying to stabilize. And then the third difficulty is, can you actually take advantage of this real devaluation to generate growth? And as we've seen until recently, it hasn't been possible. So that's one way. The second way is to renegotiate your external debt. And in our country so far, it's not really attractive because it's relatively small. And much of it is actually not Eurobond, but MDB, multilateral organizations. So I think increasingly it's a question mark. I mean, why is the IMF lending to countries where the DSA is not very credible? It's based on surpluses that may not happen, on expectation of high growth that may not happen, but yet it's a real headache to the external debt restructuring. So we're left with the third possibility, which I'll come to in the second round, which is it possible or is it feasible to grow out of that in this particular situation? And what would it take in terms of international assistance and domestic conditions for this to work? Homi.
Thank you so much, Ishaq, and thanks for that great example about the Egypt situation. I was reminded of what I thought was an extraordinary comment in the IMF's World Economic Outlook in April, where they have a chapter on debt management, and they bluntly say that for developing countries, on average, fiscal austerity has not improved debt ratios. So I don't think that the example you gave of Egypt is unique or an outlier. I think it's very much the mainstream of thinking right now. So now let's turn to Nigeria. Our next panelist is Ma Amara Ekeruche. She's a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, CSEA, which is Nigeria's premier economic think tank. Ma, floor is yours.
Thank you, Homi, for the kind introduction, and thank you, IRF, for the invitation. Today, I'll be presenting on growing out of debt perspectives from Nigeria. Public debt has increased considerably in the past decade, with external debt leading the way, and this is after we've benefited from an ad hoc debt relief in 2005, where 18 billion was forgiven. 18 billion of our debt was forgiven. So the public debt as a share of GDP has increased from about 18% to 38% just in 10 years. External debt has led the way. So external debt has increased to a considerably large extent compared to domestic debt. External debt now accounts for 40% of our total debts compared to 60% for domestic debts. And what has this new financing or new borrowing been used for? Infrastructure spending, mostly. Who are we owing? So what is the share of creditors or the creditor landscape? Mostly multilateral and private creditors. They represent a large share of our public debts. So multilateral creditors represent about 48% of our total share of debts, and private creditors represent multilateral creditors represent 48%, private creditors represent 38%. Bilateral creditors has significantly decreased over the past decade, and this has important consequences. So borrowing from private creditors, as we know, we have higher interest rates to deal with. Also, they don't necessarily lend themselves to debt forgiveness or debt relief treatments. And so even though we were eligible for the DSSI, Debt Service Suspension Initiative, we did not participate because a lot of our debts are not owed to bilateral creditors, in particular to the Paris Club creditors. The debts that is owed to bilateral creditors is mostly to China nowadays. Now again, because of our creditor landscape, interest payments are skyrocketing. In 2022, the federal government's interest payments as a share of federal government revenue skyrocketed to 98%. So that means we only had 2% of our revenue for alternative uses other than debt servicing, which is terrible. So in Nigeria, we don't necessarily have a solvency issue, but we definitely have a liquidity issue, where it's difficult for us to meet other development spending needs. This graph captures it perfectly, where we see how debt servicing dwarfs the spending for other sectors, whether it's defense, social development and poverty reduction, health, science, tech and innovation, infrastructure. Infrastructure comes a bit close, not necessarily close, it comes second whereas debt servicing gulps about 78% of our budget revenue or budget share. Infrastructure gulps only 10%, and that's second. It comes second. So that tells you the gap. Education, very minimal is spent on education. Only 4% of our budget share is spent on education. Agriculture, industry, trade, and investments. The following slides discuss the papers that we worked on under this project. I'll leave that for the second round, but just to conclude, the situation is dire, it's pretty serious, and its indicators show that it will get worse in the following years. So interest rates are increasing, growth is about 2.4%, still below 3%. Government spending is increasing. Government revenue could increase, but there are certain mechanisms I have to put in place. I'll leave that to the second round of questions as well. Thank you, Homie. Over.
Thank you so much, Ma. Very interesting, and I think a very clear indication of the massive liquidity issues that Nigeria faces, because I presume that a lot of that debt service is to repay existing stocks of debt. So now we turn to Alemayu Geda. He's a professor of macroeconomics and international economics in the Department of Economics at Addis Ababa University. Alemayu.
Yep, thank you very much. I hope this connection will be fine. I missed Aishak's part of Aishak's presentation, losing the connection. Okay, let me make clear that we did quite in-depth analysis. We produced about 3 papers. One is on drivers of debt, the other one is on the impact of debt, and the third one is about institutional aspect of the challenge of debt. So I'm trying to, to pick major findings that we got from this. And in my opinion, this is the most comprehensive data study in the country. And this study is important, not only for Ethiopia, perhaps for other African countries, because Ethiopia, in the last 20 years, we had quite good growth, not as obviously exaggerated, but quite good growth by African standard. And this is partly owing to huge domestic and external debt. And the consequence of that is severe macroeconomic instability that we observed in Ethiopia in the last 4 or 5 years, compounded by conflict. So I think, yes, debt can bring about growth, we knew that, but it has also consequences such as macroeconomic stability, including indebtedness. Now, when you see the debt level in Ethiopia is not really huge compared to threshold sustainable levels. I think debt to GDP ratio is about 51%. The threshold is about, this is a good threshold. The external is 26%. The domestic about the same, 25% of the GDP. And this is quite a progress compared to 5 years where the debt GDP ratio was 63%. Second, but when you see the composition of debt, the external debt is dominated by multilateral, similar to Nigeria, multilateral banks, in particular the IDA wing, which accounts for 52%. Multilateral banks, World Bank and African Development Bank, account for 52%, but that is dominated by World Bank, about 80% of the multilateral. The second is the bilaterals, about 28%. Here again, China dominates it. Nearly 90% is to China. And the third one is the private debt, about 19%. Now, if you add the private debt and the bilateral, which is dominated by Chinese debt, it shows you the vulnerability of the country because the terms of engagement are not as concessional as multilateral debt for about 48% of the country's debt. Now, So what is the implication of that? The debt to export ratio is huge. The debt to export ratio, goods and services, 695%. In fact, if you make it only debt service to goods only, leaving service exporters, because on a net basis in Ethiopia, the last 10 years, the net export of services is zero, then you have 1,633% of export of goods. The dates are the total debt. Similarly, the debt service claims 2/3 of the goods exporters. From this, you basically, and the reserve level is very low. The maximum we had in the last 5 years is 2.4 months of reserves. The latest is about 1 month. So this leads you to the conclusion that the Ethiopian debt problem is primarily a liquidity as opposed to solvency problem. We also try to see the impact. How many minutes? Almost done, huh? We try to see the impact. The interest payment is very high as that of Nigeria. It is larger than the spending on roads
1 minute,
and
please.
Spending all around education combined. The debt impact, we found it to be debt creating flows in the short run are growth enhancing, but in the long run, we found negative relationship between debt and growth, primarily because of debt overhang and interest payment or services. Then from this, we concluded to a number of policy implication. I think my time is up. I will come to the policy implication of this later on because I classified them as fundamental and proximate causes of debt, and for each of them, we come up with a policy implication. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and very interesting to hear about a case where a country has actually been growing rapidly, like Ethiopia, but still has these liquidity problems on their foreign exchange. Our last panelist is Koti Paul Lakuma. He's a research fellow in the macroeconomics department at the Economic Policy Research Center in Uganda.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my presentation. Our Ugandan story is pretty much similar to the story from Nigeria and Ethiopia. Yeah, we had this graph. You see that line there, the line which is in the legend, the debt stock. We had a large debt stock in the early years, that is 2005 to 6. But we had 2 rounds of debt forgiveness. One in 2006, that is the highly impoverished poor countries initiative, which drove our debt from 58% to 17%. Then we had another round of the multilateral debt forgiveness round in 2008, which brought our debt again back to 13.7% of GDP. But however, since 2010, our debt has been rising. Why? Because we had a change of focus on the things we wanted to invest in as Uganda, as a nation. We agreed to close the infrastructural gap, and that comes with and that is capital intensive, so you have to spend much more money. And we kind of slowed down on poverty reduction initiatives, which were there before. So from 2010, you see our debt rising, and this is even elevated much more in 1920 by COVID-19. You see our debt is now at 47% of GDP. Just like as the story in Nigeria, our problem is not really solvency, it's much more a liquidity issue. Our debt is dominated mostly by external debt, and that has an implication on interest rate, as I shall show later. Although the domestic portion of the debt is also rising at a fast pace, and this has implication, though it gives you legroom for refinancing, as was mentioned in the Arab world case, but it does come with implications for domestic interest rates, which makes the private sector uncompetitive, especially the MSMEs
You're muted, Homi.
We've lost Koti. Maybe we can take some of the Q&A questions while he's reconnecting. So one was directed, I believe, straight to you, Ishaq.
Are you still there?
Egypt. Hi, Koti.
Yes, yeah. Sorry for that.
Please.
Yeah,
Continue.
let me speed up. The composition of our debt is mostly by multilateral, but we see a rise of bilateral creditors and private lenders, that is commercial banks. The bilateral lenders are mostly, this is mostly Chinese loans. Commercial banks, these are international financiers, and this brings in the complexity which was faced by Zambia. How do you bring in different faces on one table? That's why in our opinion, that's why the restructuring in Zambia took 3 years, because the composition of lenders has become heterogeneous in most African countries. It's no longer multilateral creditors, but they are also bilateral and commercial banks who have different conditionalities or for them to come on the table to negotiate debt restructuring. However, COVID-19 has made China less dominant, and multilateral creditors have retaken their dominance. However, China still dominates the bilateral portion of debt. As I showed earlier in the first graph, the external debt is the most dominant of Uganda's debt, and that has implication on interest rates. Why? Because this debt is dollar dominated, and this leads to a diminishing of the supply of dollars in the market to repay the credit, and this has impacts on interest rates, and interest rate has impacts on our competitiveness. Although it makes our country more competitive, because then our currency depreciates. But we have structural issues where we don't have enough industries to create exports to take advantage of this depreciation. It has not been all bad. Debt has been growth enhancing, just as in Ethiopia. It has contributed an average of 1% of GDP. It's envisaged to continue contributing 1% of GDP up to 2025, when Uganda becomes an oil-producing country, and will need less debt. Therefore, we expect the growth to decay to about 0.2% of GDP when that happens. The next part of the presentation, I will present it in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and very interesting also to see a case of countries which are expecting a natural resource windfall at some point in the future and are using debt in some sense to bring forward those benefits. So we have I'm just going to take a few questions as we're a little bit behind, and before we go into the second round. Ishaq, there was one specific question aimed at you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the comment. The comment is that the growth that occurred before 2011 was itself unsustainable, and it is true. I mean, the basic problems in Egypt has been low and unsustainable growth and unequalizing growth, and basically, to get growth going, you need to be more open to the private sector, more open to competition. And this has been a difficult political challenge in many of the Arab autocracies. And Egypt, I think, is really a very good example of that, where what happened with the reform of the 90s is that countries did stabilize. I mean, these countries, have tough leadership. They can stabilize by tightening the belt and tightening repression. But to get growth going, you need to get the private sector to become more comfortable, to have access to finance, to compete. You need to have business climate, and those regimes are afraid of the political autonomy of really the private sector growing and potentially creating a threat to their power over time. And so instead, what we've seen then is the development of a crony form of capitalism. Only the friends of the leader can hold the height of the economies. And their characteristics much more loyalty than performance. And as a result, we get kind of a very protected capitalism that monopolizes the domestic market basically and services, but cannot grow to become globally competitive. This has really pushed growth down and created the lack of good jobs and led ultimately to the Arab Spring. And after that, it's what I said. Countries, wanted to stabilize. They spent more, but again, did not open to the private sector. When we saw in Egypt is a political stabilization where the private sector was given to military companies, basically. Different evolution in Tunisia, where kind of this political opening gave rise to a much less ordered form of corruption, but again, not a performing private sector. So true, the main deep problem is how to grow.
Thank you. So I was just looking at the questions that have been posed in the Q&A. They are mostly related to what are the policies to come out of these kinds of crises. So I propose that we actually defer those questions until after we've had our second round of comments from the panelists, which will already focus more on some of the policy issues. So let's start to do that. We'll go in the same order. As I said, in this part of the conversation, what we're really trying to do is to get to policy change. Those policy changes can be on the international front. They can be on the domestic front, but let's see what emerges from these different perspectives. So with that, Ramiro, I will turn it over to you. We're a little bit behind, so if we can do this in 4 minutes each, that would be even better to allow time for some discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to use my presentation. I don't want to further impress Ishak. So just, I mean, imagine the Latin American outlook that I pictured before. I mean, I was just listening to mass figures. And for example, in even the worst country in terms of external debt in the Caribbean, you can see the ratio of interest payments to expenditure on education, maybe 100% or less than that. So it's a completely different scenario. That's what I'm saying. In Peru, you can get interest payments to education, 20%, this rate, 20%. Peru, Chile, Brazil, Colombia. So it's a completely different scenario. So in this scenario, that is kind of more optimistic, we have a lot of issues to solve anyway. Maybe not about short-term debt solvency or liquidity crisis, but other issues. So what we have been working with IDRC, with researchers from Latin America in trying to reassess or rethink the concept of sustainability, and not for informing governments, but also for, reassessing the debt sustainability analysis, all the tools that we have to evaluate countries. So, I mean, why? Because I believe that, the social discount rate is not that high in Latin America. So we can put long-term goals as being part of the discussion on restructuring. So in a way, we are trying to, uncover the trade-offs between short-term and long-term goals. And also because we realize that shocks to public debt are coming from nature or from broken social pacts, not for a problem for managing debt or financial integration. Imagine, for example, in Honduras, I mean, we have these shocks related to hurricanes. Imagine in Argentina and Paraguay, we have shocks related to droughts. So in a way, these shocks are feeding the problems in public debt and not financial integration itself. So in a way, and also Argentina and Venezuela can be analyzed not as a solvency problem, but more of a lack of trust in governments, or something like that. We can engage in that, but we don't have time to do that. What I'm saying is that I believe that we need to work with governments and with the international financial institutions in trying to integrate environmental and social sustainability discussions into fiscal sustainability. We have been doing that in our project with Fernando Lorenzo, former Minister of Uruguay of Economy, with Luis Miguel Galindo from UNAM Mexico, trying to come up with the analytics for a new day sustainability analysis that can incorporate all these elements. And when you look at Bolivia, for example, or Peru, or Honduras, you will see the benefit of trying to have this broader analysis of sustainability. I don't have time to go into the figures, but maybe we can discuss that later on in a new seminar coming soon.
Thank you so much, Ramiro. Ishak, over to you, 4 minutes.
For these countries in the Middle East that I'm talking about, those that do not have oil and that completely different type of challenge. The oil economies need to diversify and move out of oil before 2050, when oil would not be used ideally anymore in this planet. So they have growth opportunities. They haven't allowed these growth opportunities for many reasons, for many years, for political reasons, but more than in the past, there are growth opportunities. The private sector exists, and like the 80s, it can now grow. It can be unleashed if it is competitive, it has a good business climate, access to finance. The region need to use digital technologies much more that would improve productivity in the private sector, in the government. There is the green challenge is enormous, the climate challenge. Adaptation would not increase growth, but would avoid major reduction of growth in the future. There are big opportunities on green manufacturing with green energy, and the whole nearshoring business, being close to Europe, to Asia, in the middle of all that, shortening value chain presents great opportunities for the region. So it can grow, but to do that, you need leadership, you need internal changes first, and you need supportive international capital and adjustment programs. Instead of that, what we have are veto players domestically. Different veto players. In Tunisia, for example, it's the labor union that has taken advantage of the weaknesses of government to increase their wages enormously, 15% of GDP now. They're refusing to cut subsidies for consumer goods. In Egypt, it's not the union, it's the military, literally, which is backing the regime. It's taking advantage of the weaknesses of the regime to open companies and dominate the economies and make money, partly because they are not financed from the budget, by the way. They were pushed to go and finance themselves. In Lebanon, right now, the veto players are the bankers. They're refusing. The whole financial system is frozen. So you need domestic leadership to be able to build a coalition for change, to beat the veto players, to get those that would gain from reforms together, then go to the international community and say, we need financing for that. Instead, of course, the IMF comes with very little program because they know of moral hazard. That whenever they advanced money, it was used for consumption to delay reform. Tunisia, Egypt are cases in point. And therefore, what we're stuck with are these extremely austere programs where the only way to adjust to the liquidity squeeze externally is to devalue enormously, which is just going to create more problems. So I foresee years of kind of dealing with this before we could see the emergence of good national programs that can pull out of this mess.
Thank you, Ishak. That's a combination of optimism and realism, and I'm not quite sure where you land on that. Ma, over to you.
Many thanks, Homi. I'll very quickly share my slides again. Just to begin, In Nigeria, we have a severe structural issue with regards to revenue generation. So tax revenue as a share of GDP is about 6%, which is among the lowest in the world. And so it's no surprise that despite benefiting from debt relief treatments in the past, we still come back to the same unsustainable borrowing. So the three papers that was funded by the IDRC, the first one is the debt for climate swaps, which basically in layman's terms means reducing debt servicing obligations and in exchange using that money to invest in climate projects. And so what we did was based on three scenarios, the baseline scenario, optimistic scenario, and pessimistic scenario, we identified how much we can benefit from debt for climate swaps. So what is the eligible amounts for debt for climate swaps? And what the paper finds is that we can benefit up to $11.8 billion under the optimistic scenario, where if all Paris Club debts, was performing Eurobonds and multilateral concessional debt, if they're all swapped, we can benefit up to $11.8 billion. The second paper is on carbon taxation. So what is this? What is the scope of what's if we decide to implement carbon tax as the second country in the continent? The only country that has a carbon tax on the continent right now is South Africa. If we decide to become the second country, what should be the scope of carbon taxation? What should be the points of regulation? Should it be at production or consumption level, or consumption stage rather? And also, what should be the optimal carbon taxation level? So based on 6 scenarios, we also assess the possibility of implementing a carbon tax in Nigeria. The best scenario that we've come up with is one where consumption carbon tax is put forward, is implemented, followed closely by household transfers to reduce the impact on vulnerable households, and then followed closely by production carbon tax in a phased manner. And what we see is that carbon emissions reduced by 2.4 million tons, and then the revenue generated is about 4.3 trillion naira for scenario 6. There are other scenarios as well that we put forward, but scenario 6, gives us the best option in terms of reducing carbon emissions and also generating revenue, which, like I said, is a huge problem in Nigeria. And then the third paper, assesses the extent to which closing the gender gap can impact the macroeconomy, amongst which a key indicator we looked at was government revenue. So if gender parity is achieved, so say there's gender equality, we can achieve up to 9% increase in government revenue as a share of GDP, as opposed to achieving only 6.5% right now. So that's the third paper. And so the recommendations that we've put forward from these 3 papers: first, to restructure debt to improve fiscal space for spending on key sectors. Second, to engage in debt for climate swaps, which can possibly relieve up to $11.8 billion for climate spending. Third, to implement a phased carbon tax. First, to implement consumption carbon taxes in the short term, while production taxes can be introduced later to reduce carbon emissions. Fourth, improvements in implementation and enforcement of laws against women in order to improve government revenue. And then finally, to provide temporary, targeted, and timely assistance to households and firms in order to alleviate the impact of the burden of these policy measures on vulnerable households through innovative financing sources such as carbon tax.
Thank you so much, and thank you for some very specific policy recommendations that are quantified in terms of their potential impact. Alemayo, over to you.
Good. Thank you very much. Apparently very similar. The short-term solution is very similar to Emma's point about Nigeria. Now, restructuring is almost a must. It looks like that's the government is not even paying, and this probably using the common framework, as China is a good part of the debt, about 25%. But so all forms of restructuring, interest, maturity period, principal repayment, could be helpful in the short run. Access to liquidity, this could be related to global financial architecture. If there is a possibility of setting up a global emergency credit line, like the SDR allocation last time, which distressed countries will access, including Ethiopia, will be it is beyond Ethiopians to do that, but globally something to think about. Related to this is probably using innovative development finance, including climate finance, at a global level, because IDB, the innovative development finance, has huge potential to raise a factor of 3 to 10, over 100 trillion global private finance. From that, it can raise. So this kind of things will be the short-term solution. In the long term issue, in the Ethiopian study, we found the fundamental drivers of debt are trade imbalance, terms of trade deterioration, significant saving investment gap, and institutional capacity constraint. These are the fundamental causes of that drive debt in Ethiopia. The proximate causes are fiscal deficit, debt servicing, and foreign exchange shortage. So unless in the medium term we address these fundamental structural issues, even if we cancel 100% the debt today through generous restructuring, we end up being indebted again, unless the structural problems are addressed. How do we address those structural problems? Our research suggests probably direct resources towards addressing fundamental causes of trade deficit, say diversification. Address this resource, direct them to import substitution support. And this goes, I understand this goes against the policy of global multinational development bankers, but this will be the third recommendation, that they need to reform in such a way as to address the root cause of the debt problem instead of crisis managing each time around. Finally, the institutional capacity, we found forecasting growth, forecasting debt creating capacity, forecasting the foreign exchange demanded to service debt, it has serious limitation in Ethiopia. So capacity building in those areas for local expertise. Apparently in Ethiopia, this is done by IMF and World Bank technical assistance. So capacity building on those areas, and transparency and accountability. Corruption is a major problem, and enacting laws that limit the spending level would be important. And finally, probably if the parliament can call experts, both independent university researchers and Ministry of Finance experts, when a particular date is approved, to learn what the macro implication of that date is, and then make a decision. Because the way we see it in Ethiopia today is the parliament, the proposal will come for a loan to the parliament, the parliament just approves it and go, that's it. So, but if there is that institutional setup, it may help. And finally, if you give me 1 minute, reforming the multinational development bankers and setting up credit facility for this debt stress. Restructurings need to be, the debt analysis, the debt stress analysis itself need to be changed in such a way that it should be spurring growth, encouraging social spending, and address structural issues. These should be part of the debt analysis, not the current analysis only. So this will be probably a monetized app. Debt sustainability analysis and policy conditionality need to be reformed accordingly. This is pretty much the recommendation I have.
Thank you. I see some parallels to Keynes's old questions about the transfer problem coming up again in your assessment of Ethiopia and what needs to be done. Our last panelist is Paul Lakuma. You're on mute, Paul.
Yeah, sorry. Similar to Nigeria and Ethiopia, the case in Uganda is not very far. Maybe the displacements are less than Nigeria. I see the policy outcomes of Nigeria are in a couple of millions of dollars. I don't think we are able to do that. I saw some $11 billion somewhere. I don't think Uganda may be, but it's in the same direction. One is we need a platform where we can bring all these creditors together. As I said, it's difficult. That's why the Zambia case took 3 years. It's difficult to bring all these people to agree, the private lenders, the multilateral and the bilateral. We need a platform which brings them together. I also want to concur with Professor Jeddah that capacity, institutional capacities to do debt sustainability analysis, to manage the debt, to choose the projects, choose the right projects which are beneficial to society, to women, to marginalized group, to small businesses. That capacity needs to be built, because even if we restructure or we forgive, we will still come back to the same problem of a debt crisis 10 years down the road. Why don't we resolve it once and for all? In our analysis, we found that some of the capital intensive projects have a carbon footprint, and we think Uganda would use a carbon tax. Uganda has a carbon tax, so Nigeria will be the third country. Although in Uganda, it's through the consumption tax. It's the design is through the consumption tax, so it's under excise duty. But there is excise duty dealing with carbons and hydrocarbons, managing petroleum products, cars, and plastics. So we do have a carbon tax, and we feel our analysis in the graph on the left panel shows that we were trying a carbon. If we increase the rate to 20%, we will have we will reduce carbon emissions by 13,000 metric tons that is in 2021-22, but cumulatively we could reduce up to 220,000 metric tons of carbon emissions. However, and this carbon tax would be able to raise revenue up to 440 billion Uganda shilling. That's about 100 million US dollars. That's why I said our case, the outcomes of our policy do not produce big numbers such as the ones Nigeria is producing. Nevertheless, we can raise revenue up to $100 million per year if we implemented a 20% carbon tax. However, this comes with implications because then it has impacts on households who right now heavily using energy products which have a carbon footprint, and the adjustment cost of changing from the current type of energy to renewable energy is quite large, and therefore the cost of that is about half, about $50 million or 230 billion Uganda shilling. Therefore, the net tax gain from a carbon tax of 20% in Uganda, it's about 200. That's about $50 million. 200 billion. That's about $50 million. So that's the case of carbon tax in Uganda. Generally, what we have seen is the rise of new creditors. Also reemphasizes the importance of credit rating agencies, because these ones determine the interest rate you be charged when you go to the international market. And the feeling is that these CRA agencies have been quite unfair to African countries, always giving us a rating of B+, B-, and we need a discussion around that. And then transparency and accountability of the debt, especially the one from China. Some of it, especially the one to infrastructure projects, is not so transparent at the moment. Thank you. I will leave it there and go to the main panel for other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's a really interesting set of issues. You know, given the centrality of growth in all of this discussion, it was interesting to me that the issues about what might happen to the price of electricity through a significant investment in renewables has not come up. I mean, my understanding is that in both Uganda and in Nigeria, it actually costs quite a lot, something in the order of 17 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity, whereas in some, you know, modern renewables, we're talking about delivered costs of, you know, maybe in the order of 5 cents per kilowatt hour, depending on the storage capacity in the grid. So there's a huge technological possibility, potentially, I would think, in generating more growth simply by bringing the price of power down for firms and households. Anyone like to comment on that? Paul, start with you.
Yes, yes, and that's why we are saying the introduction of carbon tax should be piecemeal, should be a step by step, because the distribution, the production of electricity in Uganda actually it's more than we need. We are producing more than we need. However, the distribution, there's a problem with transmission and distribution. A lot of power is lost in transmission, and then the distribution. It's expensive to distribute the power in Uganda because very few households can afford the connection. And while the consumption pattern is not concentrated in one area, that also makes it very expensive for the power distributors to deliver this power to families and to businesses. However, the model taken by Uganda to produce electricity has been a private-public partnership, and though through through a debt facility, which is publicly guaranteed by the government of Uganda. And yet the power cost has not reduced. Therefore, any efforts, either internally or internationally, which could help reduce the cost. The government has explored several modes. One right now, in the next, I think I was told in the next 2 years, the power sector is going to be nationalized again. It's going to be removed from a private developer who was helping distribute the power and be taken back by the public sector again. I don't know whether that will reduce the cost, and if it does, will it introduce new inefficiencies? Institutions such as World Bank have advised against that option. And we wait to see how it's going to go about. So any advisory on how the power sector, especially electricity, can be reformed to produce better outcomes in terms of pricing, in terms of consistency and the quality of the electricity.
Thank you.
Would be in the good direction.
this goes back to your emphasis on good institutions, and let's see if there is a renationalization, whether there's an appropriate governance structure to make sure that it's efficient renationalization rather than inefficient renationalization. Ma, let me come to you if you have any thoughts on this. And in the meantime, I would ask the other panelists to be taking a look at the chat and to see which of those questions they might want to respond to. And there also, Ibrahim, of course, if you would also like to intervene on the questions on the chat, more than welcome. Ma.
Many thanks, Homi. So in Nigeria, electricity is distributed by the private sector. The entire system was privatized maybe about 8-7 years ago. But that doesn't mean that we've seen efficiency yet. So the government has had to continue subsidizing electricity payments up until this year. The new administration, removed all subsidies, even for electricity subsidy. And, hopefully with this new move, we can now see private investments flow into the sector, and we can see the efficiency gains that we need to improve power supply. That being said, there's also been phenomenal strides with regards to renewable energy technologies. Most homes are hybrid powered, so they're powered on grid, but they also have solar panels slapped on their roofs as well. So that's been very notable in the sector. However, there are also issues around the implications, greenhouse gas implications on these solar panels, because we see that they're renewable energy technologies. However, they're used or they're developed with minerals, on the continent, taken to, say, China, and then shipped back again. This is all the transportation and, the procedure of developing these solar panels. We have to look into them to see how environmentally sustainable they are, and even the waste as well, of the solar panels. So that's my perspective. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. Ramiro.
Yes, I think that coming from Argentina, we are having these discussions on the future of natural gas, and because we have huge reserves here, and we are trying to come up with the proper regulatory institutions and also subnational governments are the owners of this production. So in a way, it's really, for me, the most, and also we are thinking about crop subsidizing some renewable energy, wind energy and so on. But for me, I think that the government capabilities for engaging in this type of discussions with foreign companies and also with also cronies, that are around, is really low in Latin America, and particularly in Argentina. So it's really hard to have a serious discussion when that government is ill prepared for, having a conversation and planning on this type of transition. So it's in a way we can debate about theoretical scenarios, but then you need capable governments, and even in our case where subnational governments are in charge, it's impossible to have the brains that you need, to engage in this transition. So I see that we are not prepared for having these discussions. We can bring data and experts to the table, but anyway, when you go to government capabilities, there you will find like the weakest, part of the chain. So I think that go.
Who is the most trusted international partner for you in Latin America, Ramiro, to help with these kinds of issues? Who would governments turn to? Is it one of the MD? Is it one of the multilateral development banks?
Yeah. I mean,
who is it?
yes. I mean, you can work with the Inter-American Development Bank, for example. I mean, many governments are working with them. Also, the World Bank. I mean, trying to find some, technical support. I mean, in these discussions. But at the end of the day, in a way, also for subnational governments, is easier just to keep it opaque. The dealings with different big firms and also China that is involved and so on. So I think that we can rely on technical assistance by, for example, the EIDB or the World Bank, but also I think that in a way we need to have more accountability in subnational governments as a first step, in order to engage in these discussions.
You love adding complications to problems in Latin America, don't you?
Yeah. Yes, that's our plan in life.
Yeah. Okay, we're drawing to the end of our allotted time. What I propose is that I'll give each of the panelists just 1 minute or so for some final thoughts. I'll close with you, Ibrahim, and let's do it in inverse order. So, Paul, let's start with you. You have 1 minute.
Yeah, my parting shot is the need to bring all players in the credit market on the same table. We need a platform for that. The one which brings China, the private banks, the commercial banks, the multilateral and bilateral lenders. That would ease the speed of restructuring, if at all any is going to take place, and for the countries which need extra liquidity or are dealing with solvency issues. Apart from that, I want to reemphasize what Professor Geda said, that we may continue restructuring forever if we don't deal with capacity issues in the countries which are increasingly or frequently experiencing debt crisis. This capacity goes, it's simple things like forecasting, the simple things like choosing the right projects, feasibility studies. They are not very hard things. These are things which can also be done by institutions, philanthropy institutions, and institutions such as knowledge institutions such as IDRC. It doesn't necessarily need IMF, World Bank to do it, to generate the discussion, to build these capacities. And the last one is the exploration of innovations to bring more revenue. We have seen how going green can offer opportunities, especially for a country like Nigeria. We saw a case where 11 billion is a possibility. So exploring those opportunities would also be a good place to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Alemeo.
Thank you very much. I tried to answer in the chat for some of the questions, but see, for my 1 minute message will be two. Number one, from our studies, it looks like the African debt problem is essentially a trade problem, and to be more specific, a trade in primary commodities problem. So addressing that structural issue will be some kind of a lasting solution to avoid repeated debt problems. Actually, I wrote the whole book on that. So that's number one. Number two is capacity and institutionalization that Paul mentioned, including transparency on how to get indebted, what the implication of debt is, and how we can control the government when it engages in such indebtedness, should be part of the solution. This is institutional solution. I'm impressed by the level of sophisticated institutional setup in the Ministry of Finance of Ethiopia to handle debt. They have even a particular department which deals with China, and have all the institutional infrastructure, but the capacity there, the human capacity there is limited. So investing on those will take us a good part to the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ma.
Many thanks, Homie. So my final remarks are targeted at policymakers in Nigeria. As it stands, it seems, the new government is in the mood for some reforms, and I would like to draw the attention to the three main reforms that I highlighted earlier. First is debt for climate swaps. There's real potential there if we are able to get the technical expertise, the negotiation skills to sit at the table with creditors and engage with them, and show them real value, climate projects that have great gains. I think there's potential there. Second is the carbon taxation. We just removed subsidy on fossil fuel throughout the country. We have a new large private investor, the Dangote refineries, coming on board. I think this is a time for a great initiative such as this. It can potentially increase government revenue to a large extent. And then third is improving gender parity. Now, I know there are certain goals to address things like culture, patriarchal culture. However, there are policies, programs, initiatives that can be put in place, legal, financing, MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises targeted at women, cooperatives, information, education, awareness. There's so much more that can be done to ensure that the country doesn't only depend on one half of the population, but both men and women come together to ensure that economic outputs, higher levels of economic output is achieved, productivity gains are achieved, tax revenue increases. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much. Ishaq.
To conclude, I'd say, we're looking now at the medium term, at the long term differently, right? How to save the planet, how to have sustainable growth, how to have inclusive growth. And this is going to require different policies and a lot of flows from the north to the south, a lot of capital flows. Now, between now and the realization of this dream stands this debt crisis that has come. And so how to solve that crisis is going to be very important so that we don't get stuck in losing access to finance, basically. And we have to realize, it seems to me, that we're not back to the same old mess. This is a different mess. It's a more complicated world with access to private sector, to new bilaterals. And so the developing countries are in a better shape than in the past, but they've encountered a major shock, in large part due to a recession created by this inflationary policies and the coincidence of the Ukraine war and all of that. So it's a difficult moment to pass. Now, part of passing it is figuring out ways to resolve, insolvency crises when they occur because of bad shocks or bad policies. And we're making progress, as we've seen in Zambia, and this needs to continue under the common framework, becoming more sophisticated. But the issues of illiquid countries' access to liquidity has not been addressed seriously to me so far. The access of the IMF outside of Latin America is too small. It needs to be more. There are many countries that are illiquid, have a shock, not necessarily had very bad policies, and they're not being dealt with adequately. Whether it is bigger programs of debt for nature swaps, whether it's a new DSSI, whether it's SDRs that would, strengthen the multilateral institution, whether it is a process of rescheduling, a light process of quick rescheduling. This issue still needs to be discussed, wasn't discussed in Paris. Somehow, the leaders from the South were saying the house is burning, let's focus on the short term, and the North keeps focusing on the medium and long term. And this moment, I hope, will come soon, where we'll figure better ways to address the problem of many countries so that they can actually think about the long term.
Thank you. Ramiro.
Yes, well, I think that first that again, we need to embrace this comprehensive view on sustainability. We need to bring environment and social sustainability into the discussions. I think that's the agenda for Latin America. But I think that this is a complex task. First, we need to work with governments. Governments develop in Latin America very fine debt management offices, sound macroeconomic policies, but we have still the green agenda here, the social agenda here, the agenda there. So we need to work in order to try to think how to integrate that into inside the government. So that's, we are working on that in our project in RedSur, but it's a complex challenge. That's first. Second, that we need to engage with official creditors and multilaterals, of course. Again, I think what we are working on visiting the analytics of the fiscal sustainability analysis, because again, it's a broad topic, but then you need to go to specific pieces of papers and discussions. So there, I think that we need to engage official creditors in the loop. By the way, our papers on Bolivia, Paraguay, and Honduras will be in our website. I'm going to put the website there soon. We are still finishing the final versions of the papers. And finally, I think that talking just from Argentina now, not from Latin America, that sometimes we believe that IMF and IFAs are like objective entities, and they are institutions with their interests and their biases, And for example, in our case in Argentina, we are still dealing with our problems, but also with the problems inside the IMF, in terms of who is going to set the agenda for Argentina. So again, I think that also our countries, the Global South, need also to have a louder voice within the IMF, to make sure that there we have a proper institution and not, we are going just being discussing with different voices inside the IMF, and that's a problem as well.
Thank you. Ibrahim, the last word. And I'm sorry, we're already over time, so it's the last short word.
Very quickly, thank you very much, Homi, and really learned a lot from this conversation, but I wanted to add my 2 cents in the context of domestic macroeconomic policy, because we have had very illuminating discussion about debt architecture and restructuring and liquidity issues and so on. But I think really the core of the problem is that many of our countries have chosen the exchange rate as a nominal anchor for inflation, and unable to keep up in terms of fiscal policy adjustment. Even for those countries that are highly dependent on domestic debt, they go after short-term capital inflows in order to adjust the portfolio balance. But these countries have been actually recently have been challenged by the parallel market, which actually created considerable anxiety for the authorities, the economic and political authorities. And I think that makes the domestic macroeconomic reform very important. And I would say that during the early days, in the early 2000s or 90s, Vittorio Corbo liked to tell us that exchange rate adjustment is very important, but it has to be part of a package. Working with Ishaq Dewan on this report, I think now we realize that macroeconomic fundamentalism is important, but then it has to be part and parcel of a political process that has it's a political process, economic reform. So you have to have openness, you have to have engagement at all types of platforms with civil society and stakeholders. So in fact, the question I want to pose as a parting question: are there any experiences whereby some of these countries had political or political order that is confident enough and secured enough to throw these issues for public discussion and to generate the kind of new expectations? And this is another thing I learned working from his height, is that I think is very important, that devaluation not only is necessary, but not only have to be part of a general package and a political process, but it has to be credible enough to change expectations, especially expectations of the private sector, so that it can generate short-term growth. I think some of these issues would be useful to pursue in this debate, along with, of course, the external aspects which dominates the discussion naturally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. That's a great note to end on. And of course, devaluation becomes much harder when so many different countries are trying to do it all at the same time, because then they don't all get quite so much benefit. I'd like to thank the panelists for some tremendous insights, the organizers for the logistics. I think this has been an extremely rich discussion. Thank you all so very, very much. And I believe there are a number of papers that are available. I urge people to go and look at those papers for more detail. Thank you to everyone. Bye.